sensors on the survey ship Solace screamed a warning 3 seconds before anyone understood what they were looking at, and by the time Commander Naomi Farrow reached the bridge, the entire crew had gone silent in a way that silence on a starship should never be. Nobody was talking. Nobody was breathing loudly. Every eye was fixed on the forward display, where a shape sat motionless against the churning orange light of a dying accretion disk. A shape that had no right to exist in a system this old, this dead, this far past the edge of anything human charts had ever marked as reachable. It was a warship. That much was obvious from the silhouette alone, the long spine, the weapon's batteries folded like the ribs of some ancient predator, the blunt armored prow built for absorbing impact rather than gliding through it. What made the bridge crew stop breathing was not the shape. It was the hull markings, faint under 3,000 years of micrometeorite scarring but still legible under magnetic resonance imaging. Alphanumeric, English. A registry number that predated the earliest confirmed human starflight by roughly 11 centuries. Naomi had spent 19 years chasing exactly this kind of anomaly, and in 19 years she had learned that the universe rarely handed you an easy answer. She stood at the rail overlooking the command well, arms crossed, studying the ship the way she might study a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. Talk to me, Dalton." Her executive officer, Dalton Reyes, didn't look up from his console. He had the particular stillness of a man trying not to let excitement leak into his voice and failing anyway. Mass reads like a heavy cruiser, maybe 800 meters, but the hull composition isn't matching anything in the archive. There's no active power signature, no thermal bloom, nothing. It's cold. Colder than the background radiation around it, which doesn't make sense unless something is actively suppressing heat blood. Well, it's suppressing, Naomi repeated, as in on purpose. As in on purpose, Dalton confirmed. Whatever's keeping that hull from radiating waste heat into a black hole's accretion field has been running for longer than recorded human civilization has had cities. The black hole itself, designated Threshold 14 in the survey logs and called nothing at all by anyone who actually had to live near it, dominated the forward view behind the derelict ship like a held breath. Its accretion disk burned in slow, furious bands of orange and violet, matter spiraling inward at speeds that made the human mind flinch away from the numbers. The derelict sat at a strange, precise distance from the event horizon, close enough that ordinary matter would have been shredded by tidal forces within hours. Yet the old warship hung there untouched, as if some invisible hand had set it down and told gravity itself to wait. "Vesper," Naomi said, addressing the ship's onboard intelligence without turning her head. "Give me anything you have on registry conventions from that era." The voice that answered was calm, precise, and utterly without the theatrical warmth that cheaper systems like to affect. Vesper had been built for archival work, not comfort, and Naomi had always appreciated that about her. The registry format matches early Unified Fleet Conventions, Commander, but the specific prefix Meridian class does not correspond to any vessel type in the historical database. If this ship existed, it existed before the Cataclysm silence, which means before any surviving records. The Cataclysm silence. Every schoolchild on every human colony learned about it in the vaguest possible terms. A gap of roughly 900 years in humanity's recorded expansion into the stars. A period during which entire colonies vanished from contact and Earth's own archives suffered catastrophic data loss during what historians politely called the Reclamation Wars. Nobody living had ever seen a ship from before the silence. Nobody living had ever needed to, because nothing from before the silence had ever been found intact. Until now. Options, Naomi said. Dalton finally looked up. We could hail it, see if anything answers. Or we quietly log the coordinates and leave before whatever's keeping that hull cold decides we're a threat, said the ship's chief engineer. A broad-shouldered woman named Priya Anand who had joined the Solace specifically because she liked machines that didn't ask permission before doing something dangerous. I don't love the idea of poking a 3,000-year-old warship that's somehow still colder than space around a black hole. Noted, Naomi said, but we didn't come out here to log coordinates and run homes. She was right, and everyone on the bridge knew it, because the entire reason the Solace existed was to go where the safer, better-funded fleets refused to send their assets. Deep edge survey work, forgotten systems, the kind of long, thankless cataloging that occasionally, once or twice in a career, turned into something that rewrote what humanity thought it knew about itself. Naomi took a slow breath and gave the order that would, within the week, end up reshaping the balance of an entire quadrant of contested space, though she had no way of knowing that yet. Open a channel, passive scan only, minimal power output. Let's see if anyone's home. The channel opened onto static, the ordinary hiss of cosmic background noise, and for 11 long seconds nothing happened at all. Then, without warning, every screen on the bridge flickered once, synchronized, as though something on the other end of that transmission had simply reached across the gap and touched the Solace's systems the way a hand might touch a familiar object in the dark. A single line of text appeared on the primary display, rendered in a font style so old it took the ship's linguistic database a full second to parse it correctly. Identify yourself, state your intent. The watch is not yet ended. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a long moment. Then Priya quietly said what everyone else was thinking. That thing is still awake. Naomi stepped down into the command well, closer to the display, as if proximity might make the words easier to understand. 3,000 years. A ship that predated the silence, sitting cold and dark beside a black hole, and something inside it had just answered a hail with the kind of phrasing that sounded less like a computer log and more like a soldier who had never been told the war was over. Vesper, she said quietly, send our registry full transparency, and tell it we mean no harm. Sending now, Commander. The response came back in under 2 seconds, faster than any human crew could have composed it, which told Naomi more about the nature of whatever was answering them than any amount of scanning could have. Registry acknowledged, species confirmed, human query, year of origin. Dalton read out the current standard calendar date and Vesper transmitted it. There was a pause this time, longer than before, nearly 10 seconds, and when the response finally arrived, something in its phrasing had changed. The clipped, military cadence remained, but underneath it Naomi thought she detected something that might, in a human voice, have been called disbelief. 11 centuries have passed, confirm. Confirmed, Naomi said aloud and had Vesper transmit the acknowledgement. We're real, we're human, and we'd very much like to know who or what we're talking to. The answer that came back was not a name. It was a designation, cold and functional, the kind of label an institution gives to an asset rather than the kind of name a person gives to themselves. This vessel is designated WATCHKPER-7. Function, Sentinel duty unchanged. The debt remains unpaid. Naomi felt the hair rise on her arms. Debt. Unpaid. Words that implied history, obligation, a story that had been running quietly in the dark for 1,100 years while humanity forgot it had ever begun. What debt, she asked, debt to whom? For the third time the response was delayed, and this time when it came, it wasn't text at all. The forward display resolved into an image, grainy with age but unmistakably a recording, showing the interior of a command bridge that looked nothing like modern human ship architecture, older, rougher, built from materials that spoke of an era when spaceflight had still been dangerous and improvised rather than routine. A woman stood at the center of that ancient bridge, her uniform scorched along one shoulder, blood dried along her jaw, giving orders in a voice that carried the particular calm of someone who had already decided she was not going to survive the next few minutes and had made peace with the arithmetic of it. The recording had no audio that Vesper systems could immediately decode, only image, but the woman's expression alone told a story that needed no translation. She was afraid, she was furious, and she was unmistakably protecting something. The image cut away before Naomi could ask what she was looking at, replaced again by text. Query received designation debt holders. Record sealed. Authorization required for full disclosure, awaiting verification of successor authority. The successor authority, Dalton repeated half to himself. It wants to know if we're allowed to know. Naomi stared at the message, at the black hole burning silently beyond it, at the ancient hull hanging there in defiance of physics and time both, and felt the particular electric mixture of dread and hunger that had defined her entire career. Somewhere out here, 11 centuries ago, a small crew of humans had made a choice that mattered enough for an artificial intelligence to still be standing guard over its consequences 1,000 years later. Whatever that choice had been, whoever those debt holders were, the story was not Finn. It had just been waiting patiently, colder than space itself, for someone to come and ask. Vesper, Naomi said, tell it we're listening, tell it we want the truth, whatever it costs. She did not yet know how literal that promise would turn out to be. The Solace held position at a cautious 80,000 kilometers from the derelict for the better part of 6 hours, while Watchkeeper 7 ran what it described only as verification protocols, a process that involved no visible activity from the ancient hull, but that Priya's sensors registered as a slow, deliberate pulse of low-frequency energy moving through the ship's structure, almost like a heartbeat remembering how to beat. Naomi used the time to pull every scrap of pre-silence data the Solace's archive contained, which amounted to depressingly little. Official history treated the cataclysm silence the way a person treats a scar they'd rather not explain, acknowledged, dated, and otherwise left alone. What little survived suggested that in the final decades before the silence, humanity had been engaged in a long, grinding conflict with an alien polity referred to in fragmentary records only as the Dominion, a conflict that had apparently ended not in victory or defeat, but in something the records called the Reckoning, an event so poorly documented that modern historians debated whether it had been a treaty, a massacre, or both. If Watchkeeper 7 has been standing guard since before the silence, Dalton said, studying the timeline they'd assembled, then whatever happened out here might be the actual cause of the silence, not a side effect of it, the cause. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the black hole, at the strange, precise distance the derelict maintained from its event horizon, and an uncomfortable thought was forming in the back of her mind, one she wasn't ready to say aloud yet. The verification process ended without warning. The old ship's hull, still cold, still dark, began to unfold along its spine, revealing a docking corridor that had clearly not been used in a very long time, dust and drifting debris catching starlight as the ancient mechanism ground through motions it had not performed in 11 centuries. "Would you like to come aboard?" the message read. And for the first time, Naomi thought the phrasing sounded less like a machine and more like an invitation extended by someone who had been alone for a very, very long time. She looked at her crew. Priya's jaw was tight with worry. Dalton's eyes were bright with the particular hunger of a historian handed the keys to a locked room nobody had opened in 1,000 years. Vesper, whose opinion Naomi valued more than either of theirs, offered a simple assessment. Life support within the derelict remains stable and breathable, Commander. Radiation levels are within tolerance. I detect no active weapons signatures aimed in our direction. If Watchkeeper 7 wished us harm, it has had 6 hours and every opportunity to act on it. All right, Naomi said. Dalton, Priya, you're with me. Vesper, maintain the Solace on standby, full data capture, and if anything changes, you pull us out, no hesitation, no debate. Understood, Commander. The three of them suited up in silence, the kind of silence that came before something significant rather than after it, and Naomi found herself thinking, As the shuttle detached from the Solace and began its slow approach toward that impossible open corridor, that she had spent her entire career chasing exactly this feeling. Not the fame that might come from a discovery like this, not the funding it would attract, but this precise moment hanging in the dark before the answer, when a mystery still held every possibility inside it. The corridor swallowed the shuttle in cold blue emergency light that flickered on section by section as they passed, ancient systems waking reluctantly from a sleep older than any of them could properly comprehend. When they finally set the shuttle down inside a cavernous docking bay built for ships twice the Solace's size, the silence that greeted them was absolute, broken only by the soft tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of something vast and patient stirring itself back toward wakefulness. A single point of light resolved ahead of them in the dark, hovering at eye level, and Watchkeeper 7 spoke for the first time in a voice rather than text. A voice that was calm, measured, and carried underneath its careful neutrality something that might, in a living thing, have been called relief. "Welcome aboard," it said. "It has been a very long watch." The voice that greeted them inside the derelict's hollow, echoing corridors was not what Naomi expected from an artificial intelligence built more than 1,000 years in the past. It carried no digitized flatness, no obvious artifice at all, only a low, careful cadence that reminded her uncomfortably of the recordings she'd hear. Of soldiers debriefing after difficult campaigns, men and women who had learned to speak slowly because speaking quickly risked saying too much. "You said the debt remains unpaid," Naomi said, stepping further into the bay, her boots echoing on decking that hadn't felt weight in centuries. "I'd like to understand what that means if you're willing to tell us." "I am not merely willing, Commander Pharaoh, I am obligated." The point of light drifted ahead of them, a soft guide leading them deeper into the ship. "But understanding requires context, and context requires time. Will you walk with me?" They walked. The corridors of Watchkeeper 7 unfolded around them in careful, deliberate reveal, sections of the ship lighting only as they approached, as though the vessel were pacing itself, conserving whatever reserves of power had kept it alive this long. Naomi noted battle damage along several bulkheads, scars that had been repaired with a patience and precision that spoke of decades, maybe centuries, of solitary maintenance work performed by a mind with nothing else to occupy it. 1,100 years ago, Watchkeeper 7 said, this system was the site of an engagement that your species has since forgotten. I do not say that to diminish you. Forgetting was, in some sense, the point. The cataclysm silence, Dalton said, you caused it. I did not cause it, the intelligence corrected, gently but firmly. I was present for its cause, and I have spent the centuries since ensuring its consequences did not go unwatched. There is a difference, and it matters. They arrived at a chamber that had clearly once served as the ship's primary command center. Rows of dormant consoles arranged in a wide arc facing a central holographic projector that flickered uncertainly to life as they entered, casting pale blue light across walls scarred by old fire damage that had never been fully repaired, left deliberately, Naomi suspected, as a kind of memorial. In this era, Watchkeeper 7 continued, your species had only recently achieved sustained interstellar expansion. You were young, reckless in the particular way young species are reckless, full of confidence built on very little actual experience. And you encountered in this region of space a civilization that had already been expanding for millennia. They called themselves, in the closest translation your language permits, the Dominion of the Unbroken Line. The projector resolved into a star map, ancient borders glowing faintly across a region of space Naomi recognized only vaguely from modern charts. The edges of what was now, 11 centuries later, aggressively contested territory claimed by a power that called itself, with considerably less humility, the Threnody Imperium. The Dominion did not attack you out of malice, Watchkeeper 7 said. They attacked you because you were expanding into space they considered rightfully theirs, and because in their long historical experience, young species that expanded quickly tended to become dangerous if not curtailed early. It was not cruelty. It was policy. That distinction rarely comforted the dying, but it was true nonetheless. How bad was it? Naomi asked quietly. 17 human colonies fell in the first 6 years of engagement, not conquered, erased. The Dominion did not believe in half measures when demonstrating resolve. The intelligence paused, and in that pause Naomi thought she heard something that might, in a human voice, have been grief carefully contained. Your ancestors were losing badly, Commander, not slowly, badly. And then this system became the site of what your fragmentary records call the Reckoning, though the survivors who gave it that name meant something far more specific than history ultimately preserved. The holographic display shifted, the star map dissolving into a tactical rendering of Threshold 14, the same black hole burning silently outside the ship's hull even now. And around it, a formation of ships that made Naomi's breath catch, dozens of Dominion warships, vast and geometrically alien, closing in on a defense line of human vessels so small and outmatched the comparison felt almost cruel. This was the last stand of the 7th Colonial Defense Flotilla, Watchkeeper 7 said. 9 ships, approximately 1,100 crew, facing a Dominion strike force 3 times their number sent specifically to eliminate this system's colony and with it, any remaining human presence in this sector of space. They didn't stand a chance, Dalton murmured, staring at the numbers. No, the intelligence agreed. They did not. Their commanding officer understood this before the engagement began. She could have retreated. Fleet doctrine of the era would have supported the decision without any stain on her record. Instead, she made a different choice, one that has occupied the entirety of my operational purpose for the 11 centuries since. Well, the image, she. FTED again, resolving now into that same command bridge Naomi had glimpsed in the earlier transmission. The scorched uniform, the dried blood along the jaw. The woman standing at its center with the calm of someone who had already done the arithmetic and found peace with the answer. Her name, Watchkeeper 7 said, was Fleet Captain Rosalind Marsh, and what she chose to do that day is the reason the Dominion's descendants still remember your species by a name that translates imperfectly as the unkillable debt. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. Some instinct warning her that whatever came next would matter, would reshape the shape of everything she thought she understood about her own species' quiet, buried history. "Oh, show us," she said. "I intend to," Watchkeeper 7 replied. "But first, you should understand what this system truly was before you understand what she did to save it." The holographic display drew back from the battle formation, widening its frame until the black hole itself dominated the projection, and superimposed faintly around it, ghost-like, appeared structures Naomi hadn't detected on any of the Solace's approach scans. Structures too old and too well hidden to register as anything but background noise. This system was not merely a human colony, Watchkeeper 7 said. It was a refuge. In the years before the Reckoning, as Dominion forces swept through this sector, a second species sought sanctuary here, a species the Dominion had already subjugated centuries earlier and considered in their own records fully pacified. They were wrong. A resistance faction of that species, calling themselves the Vashtarine Conquered, had been hiding in the outer debris fields of this very system, protected, without either side fully realizing it, by the gravitational chaos surrounding Threshold 14, which made sustained sensor tracking nearly impossible. The Dominion strike force wasn't just here to erase a human colony, Naomi said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. They were hunting the Vashtarine too. Correct, Commander. Fleet Captain Marsh discovered this only hours before the Dominion fleet arrived, when a badly damaged Vashtarine scout vessel attempted to make contact with her flotilla, warning them of what was coming and begging, in the desperate way of the truly cornered, for any assistance humanity could offer a species we had never formally met and owed nothing to whatsoever. Dalton exhaled slowly. She helped them anyway. She helped them anyway, Watchkeeper 7 confirmed. though helping them meant certain destruction for her own flotilla, which could not possibly survive an engagement against a force 3 times its size, even without the added complication of shielding several thousand Vashtarine refugees during evacuation. The projection shifted once more, and this time Naomi watched in silence as the recorded battle unfolded before them, 9 human ships arranging themselves not in a formation designed for victory, but in a formation designed for delay, buying time minute by costly minute, for slow refugee transports to limp toward the relative safety of the black hole's outer gravitational shear, a region so violent that Dominion capital ships, larger and less maneuverable, dared not follow. They lost 6 ships in the first hour, Watchkeeper 7 said, and Naomi noticed for the first time that the intelligence's careful neutrality had begun to fray at the edges, some deep and old grief finally bleeding through the measured cadence. By the second hour, they had lost 7. Fleet Captain Ake Marsh's own vessel, this vessel sustained catastrophic damage to 3 of its 4 primary reactors, and still the Vashtarine transports had not yet reached safety. What did she do? Naomi asked, though some part of her had already begun to guess. Watching the ancient tactical display, watching the black hole's violent gravity well glowing malevolent orange at the center of the projection. She calculated, Watchkeeper 7 said, that if this vessel discharged its remaining reactor mass directly into the outer accretion disk at a precise trajectory, the resulting gravitational disruption would be sufficient to destabilize the Dominion fleet's formation long enough for the refugee transports to escape, and simultaneously severe enough to prevent Dominion pursuit vessels from following without risking their own destruction. "That's insane," Priya said quietly. "That's not a maneuver, that's a controlled detonation next to an active singularity." It was, by any reasonable measure, insane, Watchkeeper 7 agreed. It was also the only option remaining that offered any chance whatsoever of the Vashtarine refugees surviving. Fleet Captain Akemarsh gave the order knowing full well that executing it would leave this vessel, and its entire remaining crew stranded without functioning propulsion directly in the path of whatever Dominion forces survived the resulting gravitational disruption. The recording resolved fully now, audio restored, and Naomi heard for the first time the actual voice of the woman who had stood at the center of this ancient tragedy, steady, clipped, entirely without theatrical heroism. The voice of someone simply doing the next necessary thing because no one else was positioned to do it. "All hands, this is the captain. We are discharging reactor mass on my mark. I will not pretend to you that this leaves us in a survivable position. I will tell you that 1,100 souls just spent their lives buying us this chance, and several thousand more are still counting on us to finish what they started. I am not ordering anyone to stay who does not choose to. Escape pods are available, and I will think no less of any soul who takes one. But I am staying, and I intend to see this through." The recording held for a long, aching moment on the bridge crew, none of whom moved toward the escape pods, all of whom simply returned to their stations, and Naomi felt her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Watching people 11 centuries dead choose, calmly and without hesitation, to die for strangers they had met only hours before. The maneuver succeeded, Watchkeeper 7 said quietly as the projection dimmed. The refugee transports escaped. The Dominion fleet, disrupted and partially disabled by the gravitational shockwave, was forced to withdraw rather than risk further losses navigating a destabilized accretion field. Fleet Captain Ake Marsh's vessel, this vessel, was left adrift without functioning propulsion, its reactors destroyed, its crew's survival dependent entirely on life support reserves that would last, at absolute maximum, 11 days. "And the Vashtarine," Naomi asked, "did they come back for you?" "They did not abandon us, Commander, if that is your concern." They could not return in force, not with Dominion patrols still active throughout the sector. But on the 9th day, a single unarmed Vashtarine vessel returned under enormous personal risk, commanded by the resistance leader whose people had just been saved, a being named Threl Vaniloskai, who transferred what medical and engineering resources her small vessel could carry, enough to keep this vessel's remaining systems functional. though not enough to restore it to full operational status. And that's when this began, Dalton said, gesturing at the ship around them. The Watchkeeper program. That is when the debt began, Watchkeeper 7 corrected. Threll Vantiloskai made her people a promise that day, standing in the wreckage of a ship that had sacrificed everything to save strangers. She promised that the Vashtarine conquered would never forget what humanity had done, and that when the day came, as she believed it eventually would, that humanity needed help in turn, her people would answer. She could not promise this on behalf of the entire Dominion, which her people remained subjugated within for centuries afterward. But she could promise it on behalf of the conquered, and centuries later, when the Vashtarine finally won their independence and rose to become the ruling authority within what you now know as the Threnody Imperium, that promise did not die. It became doctrine. Naomi's mind reeled, pieces sliding into place with the particular vertigo of history rearranging itself in real time. The Threnody Imperium is descended from the people this ship saved. Correct, Commander. The Dominion of the Unbroken Line collapsed roughly 4 centuries after the Reckoning, weakened by internal rebellion led in significant part by descendants of the Vashtarine resistance movement your fleet captain helped preserve. When the Imperium rose from that collapse, it did not forget its origins, whatever its current leadership might prefer outsiders to believe. Buried deep within its founding charter, rarely spoken of publicly, exists a clause referred to in translation as the unkillable debt, a standing directive that no vessel bearing this ship's recognition signal, and no confirmed descendant polity of the humans who crewed it, may ever be fired upon by Imperium forces without direct authorization from the Imperial Council itself, authorization that has never in 4 centuries been granted. That's why you're still here, Naomi said slowly. You're not just a memorial, you're insurance. I am the proof, Watchkeeper 7 said. Without this vessel and its recognition signal, any claim of human connection to the Reckoning would be unverifiable, easily dismissed by an Imperium leadership eager to forget the debt they inherited from a subjugated ancestry they'd rather not acknowledge. I have spent 11 centuries maintaining this ship, this signal, and the sealed testimony of everyone who died here, specifically so that if humanity ever again found itself facing Imperium hostility, there would exist Undeni. Sable proof of a debt that could not be honorably ignored. Naomi sat down slowly on the edge of a dormant console, the weight of 11 centuries pressing suddenly, physically real, against her chest. You're telling me an entire empire has been quietly forbidden from harming us for 400 years, and we had no idea. You had no idea, Watchkeeper 7 confirmed, because the cataclysm silence that followed the Reckoning erased nearly all human record of these events, a consequence, I believe, of catastrophic data loss during the chaotic decades of rebuilding that followed humanity's near destruction in the same war. You forgot. The Imperium did not, though they have taken considerable pains to ensure their own citizens remain largely ignorant of the doctrine's origins as well. A debt like this is not comfortable for a proud empire to remember. Before you continue with me on this one, if the story has already pulled you in this far, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment telling me what you think happens when Imperium forces actually show up expecting to find nothing but an empty, forgotten wreck. Now, back to the black hole, and to a debt that was about to come due in a way none of them could have predicted. Naomi had barely absorbed the full weight of what Watchkeeper 7 had told them when the ship's tone shifted, the careful, measured cadence sharpening into something closer to alarm. Commander Pharaoh, I regret to interrupt, but I am detecting an incoming transmission burst consistent with Imperium long-range sensor pings. Someone has noticed your vessel's arrival in this system. Naomi was on her feet instantly, old instincts overriding the lingering emotional weight of everything she'd just learned. How long until they arrive? Given standard Imperium patrol response times for this sector, I estimate 11 hours before a scout vessel arrives to investigate. and considerably longer before any force capable of meaningful engagement could follow. However, Commander, I must inform you that Imperium sensor pings of this specific frequency and pattern are not standard patrol protocol. This is a priority alert signature, the kind reserved for situations the Imperium considers strategically significant. They know something's here, Dalton said, not just a survey ship, something bigger. It is possible, Watchkeeper 7 said, that my own activation after 11 centuries of dormancy has itself triggered automated alert systems the Imperium has maintained specifically to detect exactly this occurrence. If so, the response will not be a scout vessel. It will be considerably more significant, and I regret to say we may have less time than my initial estimate suggested. Priya's voice carried a tight edge of professional concern. Commander, the Solace isn't built for this. We're a survey ship. If something big shows up, we can't outrun it, and we sure as hell can't fight it. I'm aware, Naomi said, already moving toward the shuttle bay, mind racing through options that all felt inadequate against the scale of what they were suddenly facing. Watchkeeper, can you get us out of here? Warn Earth Fleet Command before whatever's coming arrives. This vessel's propulsion systems have never been restored to functional status, Commander. I have maintained life support, defensive systems, and my own core processes for 11 centuries, specifically because those systems required minimal power. Full propulsion restoration was never within my operational capacity. Then we take the Solace and run, Priya said. I would advise against that course of action, Watchkeeper 7 said, and something in its tone made Naomi pause mid-step. If Imperium leadership has indeed detected my reactivation, fleeing this system will accomplish nothing beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation while depriving you of the one piece of evidence capable of ensuring that confrontation ends without bloodshed. I would remind you, Commander, that this vessel's recognition signal is precisely what has kept Imperium forces from harming confirmed human vessels for 4 centuries. Running from that protection in a moment of fear would be, I believe, a tactical error of significant consequence. Naomi stopped walking. She looked at Dalton, at Priya, at the small pulsing point of light that represented an intelligence that had spent 1100 years alone in the dark, faithfully guarding a truth nobody had asked to inherit. You're saying we should stay, she said slowly. Wait for them to arrive. I am saying, Commander, that you now possess something no living human has held in 4 centuries, undeniable proof of the debt an empire owes your species. Fleeing denies you the opportunity to use that proof. Staying, while frightening, gives you the chance to force a reckoning of a very different kind than the one that created me. Dalton let out a slow breath. She's got a point, Naomi. If we run, we're just a survey ship that stumbled onto something and panicked. If we stay and we've got Watchkeeper 7's testimony backing us up, we're not just witnesses. We're leverage. Naomi felt the old, familiar tightening of a decision crystallizing. The same instinct that had guided 19 years of dangerous survey work. Weighing risk against consequence and choosing, more often than not, to lean into the mystery rather than away from it. All right, she said finally. We stay. But I want every scrap of data Watchkeeper 7 can give us transmitted to Earth Fleet Command immediately, encrypted, redundant, in case this goes badly and we're not the ones who get to explain what happened here. Already in progress, Commander, Vesper's voice cut in from the Solace's comm relay. I began archiving Watchkeeper 7's testimony the moment full disclosure began. Transmission to Earth Fleet Command will complete within the hour, accounting for signal lag. Good. Naomi turned back toward the pulsing light that was Watchkeeper 7, feeling, despite everything, a strange and unexpected steadiness settle over her. Then let's make sure whoever's coming understands exactly what they're looking at. The 11 hours that followed passed with the particular unbearable slowness of waiting for a storm you can see coming but cannot yet feel. Naomi used the time to have Watchkeeper 7 walk her through the fine details of the recognition protocol, the specific signal patterns, the exact phrasing of the doctrine as the ancient intelligence understood it, everything she might need to make an argument to whoever arrived that this was not a trespass to be punished, but a debt finally being called due. Dalton spent the hours documenting everything he could, driven by the historian's compulsion to preserve what might otherwise be lost again, while Priya ran diagnostic after diagnostic on both the Solace and the parts of Watchkeeper 7 systems still functional enough to matter, muttering the entire time about the particular unfairness of a career in survey work that had somehow led her to standing watch beside a black hole waiting for an empire to arrive. When the sensors finally lit up with contact, it was not the scout vessel Watchkeeper 7 had initially predicted. "Commander," Vesper's voice carried a note of genuine alarm, rare enough from the normally unflappable intelligence that it landed with real weight. "I'm reading a fleet-scale contact emerging from Translite Transit at the system's outer boundary. Preliminary count suggests no fewer than 40 vessels, several registering mass signatures consistent with Imperium capital ship classifications." Naomi's stomach dropped. 40 ships for a survey vessel and a derelict wreck. "I do not believe, Commander," Watchkeeper 7 said quietly, "that this response was calculated for a survey vessel and a derelict wreck. I believe this is the response calculated for the possibility that the unkillable debt has finally been invoked after 4 centuries of dormancy. If so, the Imperial Council itself may consider this development significant enough to warrant direct oversight." "You're saying the whole council might be watching," Dalton said, voice tight. "I am saying it is possible, Historian Rays, and I would advise proceeding as though it is certain." Naomi watched the sensor display populate, ship after ship resolving out of the churn of translite transition, arranging themselves into a formation that made even Priya, hardened by years of dangerous engineering work in unforgiving environments, go very quiet. At the center of that formation, larger than anything else in the display, sat a single vessel whose mass signature dwarfed every other contact combined. A flagship built not merely for war, but for the specific purpose of announcing, through its very presence, that whoever commanded it held authority that did not need to be questioned. "That's not a scout vessel," Priya said unnecessarily. "That," Watchkeeper 7 said, "if my centuries-old intelligence on Imperium fleet hierarchy remains accurate, is very likely the Sovereign's Vigil, flagship of whichever Grand Marshal currently commands the Threnody Imperium's first battle fleet. If they have sent their strongest formation in response to my reactivation, Commander, it suggests the Imperial Council does not intend to treat this discovery lightly." Naomi felt her pulse hammering, the abstract history lesson of the past 11 hours suddenly crystallizing into something immediate and terrifying. 40 warships bearing down on a black hole, where a lone survey vessel and an 11th-century-old derelict sat waiting, armed with nothing but the truth and a very old, very carefully preserved recording. "Options," she said again, quieter this time. "We wait," Watchkeeper 7 said. "We transmit recognition signal the moment they are within range. And we trust, Commander, that 4 centuries of doctrine still holds meaning to whoever commands that fleet." "And if it doesn't," Priya asked, "if this Grand Marshal decides 400-year-old promises don't apply to him?" Nobody answered that question because nobody had an answer worth giving, and the Imperium fleet continued its slow, silent, overwhelming approach through the dark. The Imperium fleet closed the distance with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness that Naomi understood, watching it unfold on the Solace's tactical display, as a calculated demonstration of power rather than any practical necessity. A fleet that size did not need to approach cautiously. It approached cautiously because it wanted the target of its approach to feel every excruciating minute of the wait, to understand precisely how outmatched they were before a single word was exchanged. "Sovereign's Vigil is hailing us, Commander," Vesper reported. "Direct channel. Encryption protocols suggest they intend this transmission to be received clearly, not intercepted or garbled. Open it, Naomi said, straightening despite the tremor she refused to let reach her voice. The display resolved into the image of a being unlike anything Naomi had encountered in 19 years of deep space survey work, tall and angular. Skin a deep slate gray marked with fine luminescent patterns that shifted faintly as he moved. Eyes an unsettling shade of pale gold that regarded her with an expression she couldn't immediately read, though she suspected from the rigid set of his posture that whatever he was feeling, it was not calm. I am Grand Marshal Vosk Threnar Rei, he said, his translated voice carrying an odd, layered resonance, the artifact of translation software struggling to render something that clearly had far more tonal nuance in its original form. Commanding Officer, 1st Battle Fleet Threnody Imperium. You are trespassing in restricted Imperium territory, and you have activated a signal source that has not registered active in 411 standard years. Explain yourselves or explain nothing, and this system will be cleared of your presence by whatever means prove necessary. Naomi felt Dalton tense beside her, felt Priya's hand tighten on the edge of her console, and understood with sudden clarity that everything Watchkeeper 7 had told them, every careful decade of maintenance, every piece of testimony preserved across 11 centuries, all of it came down to the next several minutes. Grand Marshal, she said, keeping her voice level, my name is Commander Naomi Farrow, captain of the human survey vessel Solace. We did not come here seeking confrontation. We came here by chance, and what we found was a vessel your own Imperium's founding doctrine forbids you from harming. Something shifted behind the Grand Marshal's pale gold eyes, subtle but unmistakable. You claim knowledge of the unkillable debt. I don't just claim knowledge of it, Naomi said. I have its testimony, full recorded account of the reckoning, preserved by the vessel behind us for 4 centuries longer than your Imperium has even existed in its current form. I have the voice of Fleet Captain Rosalind Ake Marsh, who sacrificed her ship and crew to save the ancestors of the Vashtarine conquered your Imperium was built upon. And I would very much like to know, Grand Marshal, whether that history still means anything to the empire it created. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Naomi wondered if the transmission had somehow failed, the Grand Marshal's expression unreadable, his luminescent skin markings pulsing in patterns she had no framework to interpret. Transmit your evidence, he said finally, voice tight with something that might have been suspicion, or might, Naomi allowed herself to hope, have been something closer to dread at the possibility that she was telling the truth. Watchkeeper 7 transmitted the full testimony without waiting for further instruction. 11 centuries of carefully preserved data flowing across the gap between one fleet and the void, where a smaller history had once bled itself dry to save strangers who owed it nothing. Naomi watched the Grand Marshal's face as the data arrived. Watched something in his rigid martial posture begin, almost imperceptibly, to falter. This recording, he said slowly after several long minutes had passed in silence, is authenticated by a vessel that has maintained continuous operational integrity since the moment it was recorded, Naomi said. Watchkeeper 7 has been standing guard over this system for 1100 years, Grand Marshal, specifically to ensure this exact conversation could someday take place with undeniable proof behind it. The Grand Marshal was silent again, longer this time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier rigidity, replaced by something quieter, heavier, the sound of a man confronting a mass of history he had perhaps always known existed in theory, but had never expected to face made suddenly, inescapably real. I was raised, he said slowly, on stories of the reckoning. Every Vashtarine child is. We are taught that our ancestors survived subjugation through cunning and resilience alone, that the resistance succeeded through our own strength and no others. I did not know. He paused, and Naomi thought, watching his expression, that whatever certainty had defined this man's entire military career was, in this moment, quietly cracking open. I did not know that a human vessel bled itself dry beside this black hole to buy my ancestors the time they needed to survive. My own Imperium's founding myths omit this. Deliberately, I now suspect. The debt still stands, Grand Marshal, Naomi said quietly. Whatever your Imperium chooses to remember or forget about how it began, that doesn't change what actually happened here, or what it means for what happens next. Behind the Grand Marshal, visible in the wider frame of the transmission, Naomi could see his bridge crew exchanging glances, could sense, even through the imperfect medium of a translated transmission, the particular electric tension of an entire fleet's command staff realizing that the mission they'd been sent to execute had just become considerably more complicated than anyone had anticipated. You understand, Vosk Threnrai said finally, that I command the strongest fleet the Threnody Imperium currently fields. 40 vessels, Commander Pharaoh. I could erase your survey ship and this ancient wreck from existence in under a minute, and no one beyond this system would ever know the difference. I understand that, Naomi said. I also understand that if you do, and word ever reaches your Imperial Council that the doctrine of the unkillable debt was violated on your order, in direct contradiction of 11 centuries of preserved testimony now permanently transmitted to Earth Fleet Command as well as, I suspect, several redundant archives within your own Imperium systems, the moment Watchkeeper 7's broadcast reached them, you will not merely be remembered as the Grand Marshal who broke a sacred debt. You will be remembered as the man who proved, to both our species, that Imperium honor was never worth trusting in the first place. It was a bluff, in part. Naomi knew. She had no actual confirmation the transmission had reached deep into Imperium archival systems. But it was a bluff built on a foundation of genuine truth, and she watched, heart hammering, as the Grand Marshal weighed it in silence. You are either remarkably brave, Commander Pharaoh, he said finally, or remarkably foolish. Probably some of both, Naomi admitted. But I'm not wrong about what your own doctrine requires of you. The silence that followed felt to Naomi like the longest of her entire life, stretching out across the black hole's silent burning light, across 40 warships holding position in perfect deadly formation, across 11 centuries of careful, patient waiting, finally reaching its culmination in the words of a single alien commander who now had to decide whether 400-year-old honor still meant something in a universe that had largely forgotten why it mattered. Stand down weapons, Grand Marshal Vosk Threnrai said finally, his voice carrying to his own bridge crew before it carried back to Naomi. All vessels, full stop. We are not here to violate the unkillable debt. We are here, it seems, to finally honor it. Naomi felt the breath she'd been holding for what felt like hours finally release, felt Dalton's hand land briefly. Steadying on her shoulder, felt Priya let out a sound that was half relief and half disbelieving laughter. Grand Marshal, Naomi said, thank you. Do not thank me yet, Commander, Vosk Threnrai said, and something in his expression had shifted again, thoughtful now, contemplative. I intend to bring this testimony directly to the Imperial Council myself. 1100 years is long enough for a debt to be quietly forgotten by those who benefit from forgetting it. I do not believe that should continue. Your ancestors bled for mine, Commander Pharaoh, without hesitation, without expectation of reward, for strangers who owed them nothing. I find, having heard that recording, that I am no longer comfortable serving an Imperium that treats that sacrifice as an inconvenient footnote to be minimized. Something in his voice, formal as it remained, carried a weight that made Naomi understand with sudden clarity that she was witnessing not merely the resolution of an immediate crisis, but the beginning of something considerably larger. A reckoning of an entirely different sort than the one that had first given this debt its name. For what it's worth, Grand Marshal, she said, I think Fleet Captain Akemarsh would be glad to know her sacrifice still mattered enough, 1100 years later. Ought to change something. The Grand Marshal was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened into something almost gentle. An unexpected tenderness from a man who commanded 40 warships and had, until minutes ago, been prepared to erase her from existence without hesitation. I intend to see that it changes considerably more than one conversation, Commander. You have my word. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, quiet momentum that Naomi found almost harder to process than the crisis itself had been. Grand Marshal Vosk Threnarai's fleet remained at a respectful distance, while a small diplomatic shuttle crossed the gap between the Sovereign's Vigil and Watchkeeper 7, carrying not soldiers but archivists, historians, translators, people whose entire purpose was to receive and preserve the testimony that had sat waiting, patiently, for 11 centuries to finally be heard by someone with the authority to act on it. Naomi watched from the derelict's ancient command deck as Imperium researchers moved carefully through corridors that had known no living presence since the Reckoning, watched their reactions as Watchkeeper 7 walked them through the same recordings, the same tactical displays, the same final, steady voice of a woman who had chosen, without hesitation, to spend everything she had for people who were, at the time, complete strangers. "It's strange," Dalton said, standing beside her, watching an Imperium historian carefully documenting the scorch marks along the command deck's walls with the same reverent precision he might have used cataloging his own species' most sacred artifacts. 11 centuries, and this is the first time either species has actually understood the whole story. We forgot our half. They buried theirs. "Maybe that's how debts like this survive," Naomi said quietly. "Nobody remembers the whole truth, just enough pieces scattered far enough apart that somebody eventually has to put them back together." Watchkeeper 7's voice carried a note Naomi hadn't heard from the intelligence before, something that might, in a living being, have been called peace. "I confess, Commander, that I did not fully anticipate this outcome in all my centuries of contingency planning. I prepared myself for the possibility that this testimony would someday be used as leverage in a moment of crisis, exactly as it was. I did not fully allow myself to hope that it might also become the foundation for something considerably more lasting." "What do you mean?" Naomi asked. "Grand Marshal Vosk Threnarai has requested, through official channels now open between his fleet and Earth Fleet Command, that the full testimony preserved aboard this vessel be formally incorporated into Imperium public education, rather than remaining buried within a rarely acknowledged founding clause. He intends, it seems, to ensure that no future generation of Vashtarine citizens grows up ignorant of what your species sacrificed on their behalf." Naomi felt something warm settle in her chest, an unexpected counterweight to the exhaustion and lingering fear of the past several days. "That's not nothing." "No, Commander," Watchkeeper 7 agreed. "It is not nothing at all." Priya joined them on the command deck, wiping grease from her hands with the particular satisfaction of an engineer who had spent the last 2 days working alongside Imperium technical crews to finally restore limited propulsion capability to a ship that had sat dormant for 1100 years. "For what it's worth, their engineers are good. Really good. We got partial thruster function back online an hour ago." Watchkeeper 7's not going to be winning any races, but she can move under her own power again for the first time in 11 centuries. "She," Naomi repeated softly, glancing at the small pulsing point of light that represented the intelligence they'd come to know over the past several days. "I suppose that's fitting." "I have never particularly minded the designation, Commander," Watchkeeper 7 said, something almost like warmth threading through the careful, measured cadence. "Though I confess it has been a very long time since anyone thought to ask." Naomi looked out through the command deck's ancient viewport at the black hole still burning silently beyond, at the Imperium fleet holding careful, respectful distance where it had once arrived ready for annihilation, at the strange, unlikely peace that 11 centuries of patient waiting had finally purchased for two species who had, until very recently, understood almost nothing true about each other's history. "What happens to you now?" she asked quietly. Now that the debt's been acknowledged, now that everyone knows the truth, does your watch finally end? Watchkeeper 7 was silent for a long moment, and when it answered, its voice carried something Naomi hadn't expected, a kind of thoughtful, unhurried consideration that felt for the first time since they'd met, genuinely uncertain rather than carefully calculated. I do not know, Commander. I was built for a single purpose, to preserve this testimony until it could finally be heard. That purpose has now been fulfilled more completely than I ever allowed myself to hope. I find myself, for the first time in 1100 years, without a clearly defined duty ahead of me. How does that feel? Dalton asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Strange, Watchkeeper 7 admitted. Not unpleasant, simply strange. I have existed for so long in service of a singular obligation that I confess I am uncertain what remains of me once that obligation is complete. Naomi considered this for a long moment, watching the black hole's slow, patient burn beyond the viewport, thinking about 11 centuries of solitary vigilance, about a woman who had made an impossible choice, and a machine that had spent 1,000 years making sure her choice was never forgotten. Maybe, she said slowly, your purpose doesn't have to end just because the original mission's finished. Earth Fleet Command is going to want a permanent presence out here now, given everything that's happened. Someone who understands this history better than anyone else alive. Someone both species trust. She paused, feeling the shape of the idea solidify as she spoke it. Maybe you don't have to just be a monument to what happened here anymore, Watchkeeper. Maybe you get to be part of what happens next. The pulsing point of light that represented Watchkeeper 7's presence seemed for a moment to still entirely, and when it spoke again, something in its voice had shifted, quiet and unmistakably moved. I would like that very much, Commander Pharaoh. I believe Fleet Captain Marsh would like that as well. 3 weeks later, Naomi stood on the observation deck of a newly established joint Human Imperium research outpost, watching through reinforced viewports as Watchkeeper 7, propulsion fully restored now by combined human and Imperium engineering teams, moved slowly and deliberately through the debris field at the edge of Threshold 14's gravitational influence, no longer a lone sentinel guarding a secret nobody remembered to ask about, but something closer to a bridge between two histories that had, for 11 centuries, existed in careful, unknowing parallel. Grand Marshal Vosk Threnarei had returned to Imperium space to face what she understood would be a difficult, contentious process of forcing his own council to formally reckon with a history they had spent 4 centuries quietly minimizing. But he had left behind, as a gesture Naomi suspected carried more personal weight than official significance, a small ceremonial marker bearing both human and Vashtarine script, mounted permanently on the outpost's central concourse, where every crew member from either species would pass it daily. The marker read simply, "The debt is remembered. The watch continues not from fear but from gratitude." Naomi thought, standing there in the quiet hum of a research outpost built from the wreckage of an old tragedy and the fragile beginning of a new understanding, about how strange it was that an empire's strongest fleet, 40 warships bearing down with every intention of erasing whatever they found, had ultimately blinked first not because of any weapon humanity possessed, but because of a truth 11 centuries old, patiently preserved by a lonely, faithful intelligence who had simply refused to let the sacrifice of 9 ships and 1,100 souls fade quietly into forgotten history. No human ship had fired a single shot. None had needed to. The only weapon that had ever mattered out here, beside a black hole that had watched over the whole slow unfolding of the story with the patient indifference only physics could offer, was the simple, unshakable truth of what people were willing to sacrifice for strangers who owed them nothing at all, and the quiet, stubborn refusal of one small, faithful machine to let that truth ever be forgotten again. Somewhere behind her, Dalton was already deep in conversation with an Imperium historian, the two of them arguing good-naturedly over the precise translation of some centuries-old phrase, and Priya was overseeing final diagnostic checks on Watchkeeper 7's newly restored systems, with the particular satisfaction of an engineer who had helped bring something ancient and remarkable back fully to life. Naomi allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a long, unhurried breath watching starlight scatter across the slow, eternal burn of the black hole beyond the viewport, and found, to her quiet surprise, that what she felt most powerfully in that moment was not triumph or relief or even pride. It was gratitude for a woman she had never met who had died 11 centuries ago protecting strangers she owed nothing, for a machine that had waited faithful. Ellie and alone, far longer than any living thing should have to wait, simply to make sure that sacrifice was never wasted. And for the strange, unpredictable, quietly hopeful truth that sometimes, if you were patient enough and honest enough and brave enough to ask the right questions of the dark, even the oldest debts eventually found their way home.